Psalm 4, an exegetical and biblical theological commentary. Welcome. This is a reading of the commentary on Psalm 4. Psalm 4 occupies a strategic place in Book 1 of the Psalter, Psalms 1 through 41. It functions as an evening prayer of confidence that intentionally pairs with the morning lament of Psalm 3. Within the progressive unfolding of God's promise plan, this psalm reflects the experiential reality of the Davidic covenantal king facing intense social conflict, royal opposition, and defamation. As the anointed representative of Yahweh's earthly kingdom, David's historical distress is not an isolated event. It belongs to the broader canonical narrative in which the seed of promise faces opposition from human rulers who pursue vanity and false gods, echoing Psalm 2. Placed after Psalm 3, where David fled from Absalom, Psalm 4 broadens the scope of covenantal testing to address the spiritual and political hostility of high-ranking adversaries, the sons of men, who seek to turn the king's glory into shame. In the Hebraic cognitive horizon, the king's vindication is inextricably linked to Yahweh's sovereign election and righteous order. The psalm establishes that genuine rest and security do not derive from political coalition or material abundance, but from the unmerited favor of Yahweh, who sets apart the godly for himself and promises ultimate cosmic vindication through his Davidic line. We turn now to the exegesis of the psalm. The psalm opens with an urgent invocation directed to the divine court, establishing Yahweh as the sole source of covenantal justice. In verse 1, David appeals to God as the God of my righteousness, acknowledging that his personal and royal standing rests entirely upon God's righteous character and judicial vindication. The phrase, "in distress you have enlarged me," draws upon a spatial metaphor. Distress represents a tight, suffocating place, whereas divine deliverance brings the psalmist into a broad, unconstrained space. This historical memory of past covenantal intervention forms the empirical basis for David's present plea for grace and for divine audience. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. David then turns his address from the heavenly throne to his earthly adversaries, calling them to account for their rebellion against Yahweh's covenantal order. In verse 2, he addresses the sons of men, men of rank or influence, highlighting a societal crisis in which noble figures leverage their power against Yahweh's anointed. Their primary offense is twofold: turning the king's glory or honor into disgrace, and actively loving vanity or emptiness, while pursuing lies and delusions. In the context of ancient Near Eastern covenant loyalty, this reflects an embrace of false deities or fraudulent political schemes over Yahweh's established truth. The first Selah pauses the composition, forcing the assembly to ponder the futility of human rebellion. In verse 3, in response to their hostility, David asserts a central tenet of promise plan theology. Yahweh has set apart, or made marvelous, the godly one, the covenant faithful one, for himself. Divine election guarantees that Yahweh is not silent or distant. He actively hears when the Davidic king cries out to him. David next offers prophetic counsel to his detractors, guiding them away from destructive rebellion and toward authentic covenantal piety. In verse 4, the instruction, "Be angry or tremble and do not sin," balances emotional honesty with moral restraint. The verb denotes physical shaking or deep internal agitation, whether from anger or fear. Rather than allowing emotional indignation to explode into overt rebellion, the adversaries are commanded to engage in silent self-examination upon their beds. Speak in your hearts upon your beds and be still. The second Selah marks this call to reflective silence before God. Verse 5 requires that external quietude yield positive covenantal action. Sacrifice the sacrifices of righteousness. True worship requires more than hypocritical or mechanical ritual. It demands offerings presented in moral integrity, backed by genuine internal trust in Yahweh. The final movement transitions from public confrontation to profound internal confidence and joy rooted in God's presence. In verse 6, David captures the cynical voice of the populace. Who will show us good? In times of economic or political distress, human hearts succumb to skepticism. David answers this despair by invoking the Aaronic priestly blessing from Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Yahweh. Divine favor alone constitutes true goodness. In verse 7, Yahweh grants a superior spiritual gladness in David's heart that far surpasses the material joy experienced by his enemies during peak agricultural harvests of grain and new wine. The psalm concludes in verse 8 with a triumphant declaration of rest. In peace I will both lie down and sleep. David can sleep defenseless in the dark of night because safety is not secured by a military guard, but provided by Yahweh alone. Later, biblical writers organically connect the individual experience and ethics of the Davidic king in Psalm 4 to the person, work, and community of Messiah Jesus, demonstrating how the text's promises find their canonical fulfillment. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, the Apostle Paul quotes the Septuagint rendering of Psalm 4, verse 5, "Be angry and do not sin," to establish an abiding covenantal ethic for the new covenant body of believers. Paul demonstrates that David's exhortation against letting anger turn into sinful action or demonic opportunity remains directly binding on the church as the one people of God. In Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, Paul draws upon the structural trajectory of Psalm 4, moving from distressing petition to profound peace, exhorting believers to replace anxiety with prayer, resulting in the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, guarding their hearts just as Yahweh guarded David. In John chapter 14, verse 27, Jesus' upper room declaration, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you," encapsulates the psalmist's realization in Psalm 4, verses 7 and 8, that divine rest is qualitative, distinct from worldly security or economic abundance. In Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11, the author develops the theology of divine rest, showing that the physical safety and sanctuary rest enjoyed by David in Psalm 4 prefigure the ultimate spiritual Sabbath rest made accessible through the faithful high priestly work of Jesus. When viewed through the lens of promise plan theology, Psalm 4 exemplifies the organic unity of divine revelation across the Testaments. The historical reality of King David, facing real political hostility, lying accusations, and economic instability, is neither an isolated ancient relic nor a mere allegory. Historically, David experienced Yahweh's tangible protection, pointing to the truth that God keeps his covenant promises to ethnic Israel and his chosen royal line. Yet, in the progressive development of redemptive history, David's experience serves as an archetype for his ultimate descendant, Jesus Christ. As Martin Luther observed in his Christological reading of Psalm 4, the literal sense of the Psalter finds its head in Christ. It is first the Son who calls and is heard by the Father in his passion and death, whose vindication establishes peace for his body, the church, and subsequently provides the pattern of rest for every individual believer conformed to his image. The physical realities of Psalm 4, sacrifices at the altar, the light of God's face in the sanctuary, and peaceful sleep in the land of promise, do not lose their concrete historical significance, nor are they erased by supersessionism. Rather, they expand organically into cosmic fulfillments. The light of God's face shines definitively in the face of Jesus Christ, and the sacrifices of righteousness find their ultimate grounding in Christ's once-for-all atonement, which empowers his people to offer spiritual sacrifices of trust and obedience. Psalm 4 assures the one people of God that despite the prevailing noise of a rebellious world seeking vanity and lies, Yahweh's election stands firm, his presence provides a joy superior to earthly wealth, and his ultimate kingdom guarantees an everlasting, unshakable rest.